Hey everybody, and welcome back to the Tonic podcast. I am joined here with my friend Drew Nepley. Drew, how are you doing?
Doing all right. Kicking it on a Sunday. Not too cold, not too hot out here, so feeling good.
Nice. Good to hear. I'm a little nervous about my Packers-Niners game in a few hours, but I think I'm going to get my mind off that, and I want to talk about Russia, and more specifically, Vladimir Putin. I think everyone lately has been talking about Russia in the form of their election interference, right? And maybe Trump's connections to this. But today I want to speak about more of a domestic Russian topic, which is Vladimir Putin and his State of the Union speech. So earlier this week, Putin announced a radical overhaul of the Russian constitution, and he's putting a referendum on its proposed terms. This is kind of a big bombshell because Dmitry Medvedev resigned as well, along with the entire cabinet. And according to The Economist, the reason for Mr. Medvedev's ejection and replacement by an obscure technocrat are really wrapped in mystery, right? And obviously this is nothing new. For the last 20 years, Putin has been playing with term limits, right? I think it was back in 2008. Yeah, he stepped down. Mr. Medvedev became the president, and then Putin came back in 2012. So it's nothing new here at all. And to me, it just seems like Russia is a dictatorship that's been masquerading as a democracy for a long time. And so I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean that I saw. I think it was the link you had posted from the BBC that said that they defined Russia as a managed democracy. So like, yeah, like people can go out and vote and technically pick their representatives in the parliament and stuff, but it's very managed, and like, there's pretty much like a pro-Kremlin party has the power, and they do everything they can to keep it, and to the point where they're using tactics like this to kind of go against what democracy stands for, which is the peaceful change of government based on what the people want. Whereas this looks like to be kind of the changing of the constitution to allow Putin to be the leader, maybe not in official title, but in actual power and legitimacy. He's still going to be the guy. And you said, Medvedev, I mean, they did that kind of seat swap in 2008 through 2012 to kind of, game the system. And then they just swapped back seats. And it seems like Medvedev has pretty much been Putin's like lackey and fall guy for the last 20 years, kind of just doing what he says. He doesn't really have his own personality and his own vision for Russia as prime minister. It's pretty much he does what Putin says, which is very interesting and kind of very scary, right? Because you have this supposed democracy. It's supposed to be a post-Soviet Russia, but it's run by Putin, who is a KGB operative who is kind of running it like Soviet Russia or Soviet Union. So it's just kind of disheartening, but it's also like in a strange way kind of funny that they do all these things that like it's so obvious to the outside world that this is not a democracy, but yet they kind of tout like they're still one.
Yeah, that's a very fair point. And it is just kind of crazy and almost funny, almost laughable, because I mean, I think the rest of the world sees what's happening here, and I'm interested to see what the Russian people truly think, because he's relatively popular back home. Right. And so it makes me question maybe if people value someone like him more so in a place like Russia than maybe in the West, where we really value open elections. But it is interesting. I was reading a scholarly article back in college. I forget what it was called, but it kind of coined the term tandemocracy for what Putin and Medvedev have done, where it's just kind of this flipping in and out of leadership, basically just to kind of fight the rule of term limits. And so it's kind of interesting stuff, And I mean, this is nothing different to me than other authoritarian regimes in the region. Like you have Kazakhstan, and I can't pronounce this gentleman's name, but their president, it's like Nazarbayev, I think it is. Mm-hmm. He became his independent country's first president in 1990, but he stepped down last year but now he's become the quote unquote leader of the nation, and so he's the leader of the ruling party, right? So he's not president by name, but he's still running the country. And I think this is a common trend. We see it all over Eastern Europe and Asia. And, I'm not really too surprised. What I did want to talk about were the specifics of what he's doing, because it is interesting. And actually, I've seen mixed views on this. And some people actually say it might be good for Russia in the long term.
Sure.
So I just wanted to lay that out, is that basically what Putin is also suggesting is expanding the powers of the Duma, which is the parliament. And up until now, the Duma has pretty much been a rubber stamp parliament, right? They just pass whatever goes through and whatever Putin wants, basically. And so by expanding this Duma, some people actually think in the long term, it actually could be better for creating a more democratic system, because there'll be more power in the parliament and not just under Putin's watch. And so it is interesting to maybe look at that and say maybe a weaker presidency and a stronger parliament would be good for Russia's democracy. And these constitutional reforms could be doing that. Now, obviously, we know that Putin has always ulterior motives, and he doesn't have a good track record of openness. So what he's saying and what he's doing are probably not going to be the same thing, because he was asked by a war veteran on the occasion of the 77th anniversary of the siege of Leningrad if it was time to abolish term limits for presidents altogether. And Putin said, in quotes, "As regards to presidential terms for staying in power, I understand that this is linked for many people with worries about societal, state, domestic, and external stability. But he said it would be very worrying to return to the situation we had in the mid-1980s, where state leaders stayed in power." Which is kind of funny he's saying this, because like you said, he's a KGB operative who flourished inside of Soviet Russia and clearly has a nostalgia.
Right.
So I don't know.
No, I know it's very strange, because and that's the thing is, I think he might be able to get away with this if he controls the narrative in Russia, right? Because you're right, because he says it's giving more. He's trying to give more constitutional power to the parliament, and that sounds more democratic than putting all the power in one president or prime minister on the surface. But it also looks like he's trying to kind of have like a shadow government, right? So. The BBC is reporting that the role of the little noticed state council is central to this plan. Mr. Putin is already the head of the state council, and basically the state council is wrapped up in these constitutional changes to be given more power. So it looks like that with this whole state council thing, Putin would be the kind of remain in power despite who is the president in parliament. Even though they'll try to control the narrative to make it look like it's more democratic, because people aren't stupid, right? Like if he just went straight out and was like, "I'm president for life," no one can run against me. This is a whole change. There would be protests. There were protests when he did the whole seat swap with his buddy Medvedev, because people knew what was going on. They knew exactly what was going on. They're like, we know what you're doing. But it's just how the public support wasn't great enough to cause any change. But it was definitely worrisome. Like millions of people were protesting in Moscow in late 2000s, and I think the BBC article that you had mentioned that we both read now has a good point about where the country is as a whole, right? They're saying that the patriotic blip over the 2014 annexation of Crimea has faded. And now it's back to harsh realities, right? The economy is not that great for Russia right now. And I think that's also why he picked this new guy, Mikhail Mishustin. Again, for all these, Eastern European names, people are just going to have to forgive us. But but this new guy is he's been head of their tax bureau for a decade. And this is a really economic savvy new prime minister. So I wonder if Putin has this new prime minister to tackle the economic problems to get the people back on his side, so that he can get away with these constitutional changes over the next 4 years without much protest.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good point. I think you're onto something there, because it's true. We have to remember that Putin is not an idiot. He's very in touch with, I think, public sentiment and just how the nation is going, and you're right. The Russian economy is not booming right now. And I think people are noticing it. And so it seems to me like a PR move, in all honesty, to not put Medvedev back and to go with someone else, like you said, a tax guy. Because I think there's going to be less riots if that happens, and the Kremlin needs to be smart about this. And it's true that Russia kind of has taken a very active foreign policy role. I would say in the last decade, more or less. Crimea, Syria, Russian election interference. They've been very busy, and I think that we don't look at like enough of these domestic problems. But the country is not doing well. There's reports of these giant malls in cities that are just empty.
Right.
And people are probably getting fed up, and they look across the border, in other more open countries like Ukraine and Poland, and they kind of go, well, why can't we have more of that? And young people are not big supporters of this Russian regime. And I mean, The Economist last year called Vladimir Putin the 21st century czar.
Right.
And it's just kind of funny that it's done this full circle, from the Bolshevik Revolution now back to almost a ruler for life who is, I think, probably one of the richest men in the world. No one knows exactly his wealth, but he's basically a far right version of a Soviet leader, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean,
So,
yeah. I mean, he's hardly a paragon of democracy and progressivism. Yeah, like,
right.
and you said his net worth is unknown because I mean the guy has sway over all the Russian oligarchs. So like, that's like you can't even put a number on his wealth and power if he controls billionaires and everything like that. I mean, and again, as far as political power, just an example of how much of a grip he has on the Russian government is when he suggested Mikhail Mishustin, the new guy, to be the prime minister. No member of parliament voted against it, none.
Hmm.
And so in almost any democracy, and especially a pluralist one like a parliament, you're going to have some kickback, right? I don't think anything happens in the UK without some disagreement. Nothing happens in the United States without some, if
Uh-huh.
we're getting a judge approved or a position approved, Congress is always going to have at least somebody that disagrees. But the fact that Putin was able to do this constitutional change that is creating so much news, pick a new guy out of nowhere that was relatively unknown to the world, and have no member of parliament vote against it, that just says a lot of like how much of a grip Putin really has on his government, even though it appears like a democracy.
Oh, completely. And it's really not a democracy. I mean,
It's not.
it's a rubber stamp democracy, and I mean, to me, the most worrying point, it was in The Economist as well, because they had a nice article this week on it, and they were basically like, this is kind of giving other authoritarian governments an example of how to kind of have a fake democracy, because China's was so blatant, right? Xi Jinping basically said, "I'm ruler for life," and he scrapped parts of the constitution.
Yeah.
But Putin's giving kind of a more sinister way to do it. And this, it could be an example for some of these other Eastern European countries that are borderline. Like, I mean, you have Hungary, Poland, the Czech Republic, where they have some questionable leadership. And I think Putin's kind of giving a blueprint of how to circumvent the democratic system, but still maintain the image of one.
Right.
I read a really interesting article coming up to this today. It was called "What Does Putin Really Want?" from the New York Times. I think it came out in like 2012, so it's a little old, but it was a really nice article. The columnist went to Moscow and tried and actually sat down with a lot of Kremlin officials. Obviously, didn't get to talk to Putin, but the interesting quote from one of the people he talks to is that he says, "Nationalism comes in different disguises. America's nationalism comes in the disguise of universalism, but this universalism is basically the American national model being expanded." He said Russia's nationalism is inward looking. Students come here with the idea that Russia is a great power. It has all the rights it deserves, but it's being mistreated. There's a huge sense of being betrayed. And so I think this is like basically this article talks about since 9/11, Putin actually tried to be friends with both England and the United States. And it worked out at first. But then with ties to Iraq, the regime by 2007 was very against U.S. Iraqi policies and kind of stepped away. And then you've seen Putin kind of lashing out. Like they use the term active defense is kind of how Putin's been acting since 2007. You have Syria, the Crimean invasion,
Right.
interference. And it kind of seems like it makes sense to me that there's this feeling of being betrayed, and Putin's kind of almost trying to make Russia great again. And I think that's why a lot of people back home actually like him more than you would think. And so it is kind of interesting, like, because I just don't think Americans or Russians understand one another and the politics of it. And in some ways, I mean, I think that Putin is just the result of a collapsed Soviet empire that, felt betrayed and lost and wanted someone to bring him glory again.
Right, it's the phoenix rising out of the ashes, but the phoenix is still made up of those ashes, right? You know, we talk about
Right.
like you're probably right. Like Putin, you said it earlier, you know, flourished in Soviet Russia. He probably obviously you can't just recreate it exactly with the name and the propaganda and everything, but you know he probably Putin's golden years, his glory days were probably that the years at the end of the Soviet Union for him. So he probably wants to get back to that, you know, to Russia to be considered the other global power. Because right now, I mean, obviously, you know, the United States, especially, we have a pretty negative and worrisome opinion of Putin with the elections and everything. Um, but it's not like it was in the middle of the 20th century where it was the United States was a bloc and the Soviet Union was a bloc. Now Russia's like, you know, like way behind the United States and China as far as like like world power stage. And you could maybe even make an argument that they're on the decline. And so, yeah, I mean, it's just trying to get. It is kind of like trying to make Russia great again in a strange way, to bring back its legitimacy and its power. But he has to do that within the, you know, parameters of a quote unquote democracy, because the people, like you said, the Russian people aren't stupid either. I mean, you know, especially nowadays, they have the internet. They have access to information. They know what's out there in the world. It's not like just a state-run propaganda machine anymore. So yeah, if things get bad and they see that it's not as bad in other places, the people get upset. So he has this balancing act he has to do, and I think that's what we're seeing. He's realizing, look, I got 4 more years. I need to figure out a way for me to stay in power without pissing too many people off. So I'm going to start now. So we're going to have all these, you know, shadow councils and more power to the parliament. But in reality, he's going to really have all the on the ground say and influence in all these dudes. And then, yeah, he's going to put in some lackey that's just going to, you know, like you said, rubber stamp it. But it is worrisome. I do hope that, like right now, we're obviously in the beginning stages of this massive change. I wonder if, you know, the next step or a couple steps down the line, there'll be something a little bit more clear about him seizing power for the long run. And then if we'll see protests. You know, that's really going to be the thing. Is it's going to have to be the Russian people realizing, hey, whoa, this is kind of sketch, and we'll have to see some kind of protest or something.
Yeah, that's a very fair point. You know, and I think you touched on it there as protests. I mean, I don't see this ending great in the long term, just because it's almost like after the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia kind of lost the Zeitgeist battle, like the battle for the prevailing ideology, right?
Absolutely.
Communism, socialism lost to Western democracy.
Yes.
And the problem is, I think that this whole Russian experiment right now is inevitably going to fail, because they're trying to hold on to something that people don't particularly like.
Right.
Uh, and so, yeah, I don't know what's next, but it does seem that, I mean, eventually, I could almost predict, like, I know a few weeks ago we were talking about, you know, our 2020 predictions. So this would be more my 2025 prediction, would be another revolution in Russia. Maybe not a violent one, maybe a kind of a 21st century revolution of protests and internet campaigns. And I just don't see the way things are going to last forever. I mean, these oligarchs and Putin just have vast wealth, and they've really hurt and killed a lot of people to get this, you know. But the other thing that I do find interesting is this guy Michael Malice was on Joe Rogan last week, and he's kind of a far right troll. But he sometimes has some interesting points, and basically he said that we're so critical of Russia and seem to brush off China sometimes, but it is interesting to think that you can leave Russia. You can travel outside of Russia.
Right.
Tourists go to Russia. There is this, I don't know if we give it enough credit sometimes, that this is a relatively open country. You obviously cannot speak out against the government, or as we've seen with that Alexei, I'm spacing on his name, the liberal that's running against Putin, that got acid thrown at his face.
Yeah.
But I think we compare it to China a lot, and I mean, they are allies and whatnot, but there is a sense of openness in Russia, I think. Sorry,
Yeah.
long rant to say that.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, obviously, it is not the Soviet Union, right? Yeah, it is not. It is a different country today, and I think the people are also different and have a different outlook on the world. You know what I mean? I mean, it's, you know, the average Russian has a smartphone and access to the global information, and it's just very different than like a closed system. And like, yeah, like, okay, there's definitely, you know, journalists getting, you know, disappearing at a strange rate, the ones that criticize Putin. But the average person, if you post it on Facebook, like, you know, Putin sucks, you're not going to go to jail. You might, you know, you might get put on a list or something, but you're not going to go to jail. Like, you're allowed to speak out against the government to a point. I think it's when you're a real threat, like a journalist doing investigative journalism, that's when they take the steps to, like, you know, make you sleep with some fishes. But so, like, yes, it's definitely not the Soviet Union, but it's definitely not the open democracy that it's touting itself as. But I also want to go back to your point about like how long this might last. It might just last with Putin, right? I mean, all it takes is one guy, especially in a place where one man can have so much power. All it really takes is one person to start changing things. I mean, look at the Soviet Union, for example. You had Gorbachev, who was the last, you know, Soviet head, and he changed the country dramatically, especially after Chernobyl. He grew up as a poor Ukrainian boy underneath Stalin, so he understood how terrible it was for some people under communist rule. But then he just worked his way up to the top of it, and he understood that reform was necessary. He needed to, especially in as well as the Soviet-Afghan war, he understood that so the Soviet thing wasn't going to last forever, and that he needed to kind of open up the world a bit. You know, Gorbachev tear down this wall, right? The wall was torn down, and eventually, obviously, the Soviet Union collapsed. But it can change with whoever's in the lead, especially in a place where it's so much power is in the hands of one person. So I wonder if you know, if Putin dies in 10, 15 years, or just becomes, you know, decides to like too ill or something, if the next head just can really change it and go the opposite route.
That's an interesting point, and it's very, very true. Is that you don't always have to outlive a regime; you just have to outlive the figurehead of it, right?
Right.
And that's a point well taken, you know. And I just think for the betterment of the West, for the betterment of Russian citizens, that he needs to. I think they need a new leader, you know. I read a book. I read a book like 2 years ago. I've always been fascinated with Putin. It's called The Man Without a Face: The Unlikely Rise of Vladimir Putin. It's by this gal, Masha Gessen, I believe it's pronounced, and she's a Russian American journalist who now lives in the West, for obvious reasons. And she just wrote a pretty telling book about Putin's rise. You know, he went from a low-ranking KGB officer in East Germany, you know, single room apartment, wife and baby. And, you know, he just grew up early with this distaste for the West and democracy. And, but he's done some horrible things since he was put in. I mean, basically there's a lot of evidence that shows they planted, like they basically orchestrated a school shooting it was in a small Russian town. I forget the name. It's been a while, but, they basically orchestrated a school shooting and killed a bunch of kids and blamed the Chechens on it.
Jeez.
There was like a mall fire that they found, KGB or not K, the current intelligence sources where they found like Russian explosives, not Chechnyan weapons, and he's done a lot of shady stuff to go to war to maintain power. What he's done with homosexual rights in the country is also not great, and so. And I mean, no one talks about this. This could be a whole other episode one day. But what's happening in Chechnya to gays and other minorities is not good. So
no, absolutely not. No, there's camps. They're putting people in camps for their sexual orientation. Mm-hmm. It's pretty abysmal. No, I mean, There's no doubt in my mind that that Putin has had a troubled past, to put it very lightly. Yeah, I know, but he seems like your typical, like, do anything to maintain power, and there's not really like an ethical code other than, like, you know, promote Russia and their government. And so, yeah, so that's why, like, it's a good point you bring up all his past transgressions, because when we hear him, and we'll probably continue to hear him talk about how his reforms are going to be good for the democratization of Russia and will bring the people closer to their representatives, I just don't buy it, right? Because if you look in his past, he's done nothing of the sort, and he's never been like touting that and now all of a sudden he's trying to do that. It's like it's very obvious to me that it's a ploy.
Yes. Yeah, I think you're very correct. It just seems like a ploy, and the problem is with all the fake news networks and troll farms, a lot of people are going to believe it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I met a Russian programmer in Italy a few years ago, and I talked with him over a few beers, and he was telling me he lives in the West now, but he worked for some of these troll farms, and it was kind of an interesting conversation where he just told me, yeah, they basically just want to just cause discourse in China, or just chaos and discourse inside of China, or not China, inside of Russia and in the West. And he's like, there's places where you just go and sit there for 20 hours and work on these campaigns. And yeah, it's just a fascinating country. And I mean, Putin's a really fascinating leader as well.
Yeah.
But I'm just worried about, like, speaking about the U.S. now and Russia, I'm just worried that politicians on both sides have not done enough about Russia and Putin. I mean, the Trump administration, obviously we could talk about that for ages, but they have increased sanctions on Russia and really haven't changed much from previous administrations.
No.
But I don't think it's really doing anything. And the problem is we identified China as America's long-term threat, but a militarily powerful Russia under Putin's leadership that is now friends with Beijing is kind of a scary outcome for the future,
Well, how many Crimeas do you let happen until you have to do something, right? Like, you know what I mean? Because think about it. Like, just in 2014, Russia basically invaded a sovereign state and took it, and they they claimed, oh, it was pro-Russian rebel groups and stuff, but there's a lot of evidence that there was like black helicopters dropping troops, and like I don't know about you, but I don't know if any like rebel militias are able to get like Black Hawk helicopters. So it's like it's pretty like it's just how many of those do you let happen until you have to do something about Russia? Hopefully they don't happen anymore. But yeah, it's a good point. It's a good point that Russia's clawing for its legitimacy back on the world stage, and they're willing to rig elections to do so. They're willing to change their constitution to do so, and they're willing to literally annex parts of sovereign states to do so. And they may not be the biggest dog in the room, but they're certainly barking pretty loud. So yeah, it's interesting to see where this will go. And again, a lot of these things, it's gonna, like we said about other stuff like Venezuela. A lot of it's gonna have to come down to the reaction of the people in the country. Because outside forces can only do so much, as we've learned the hard way through Iraq and Afghanistan. A lot of long-lasting, stable social change has to come from the people within.
It's a very good point. It's a very good point. So yeah, we're just gonna have to wait and see on that. But I'm semi-optimistic. Just reading about kind of the younger Russians who are against it. And I think there's a big generational flip. I think older Russians, that actually grew up in the Soviet Union have somewhat of a ignorant nostalgia.
Rose-tinted glasses.
Exactly. Because the grass is always greener on the other side. But this new generation hasn't grown up in a Soviet-controlled country. They've seen, they have smartphones, like you said. They watch American shows, and I think that they just don't want this oppressed government, and so it'll be interesting. But I'm just worried that because Russia and China are so close, that Russia doesn't even have to be the biggest dog. But with Chinese support and Chinese technology, and maybe they will start playing around in the Baltics or seize Belarus or something. You just never know.
Yeah, or at least influencing it, with cyber war, so that we don't see anything change on the surface, but the soft power underneath is Russian influenced. We'll see. Fascinating stuff, though. Interesting times, though, with Vladimir Putin changing up the game. The shifting sands.
Yes, indeed so. I don't know if you have any thoughts, but I've pretty much shared everything I can think of for that.
Yeah, it's just something to keep an eye on in the next, 4 years. If for people out there interested in international relations, Russia's obviously a big player, and now with this whole constitutional change-up, it'll be interesting to see what happens.
Indeed.
All right.
So yeah,
that'll wrap up this episode of the Tonic Accord, guys. Check us out on Facebook, Podbean, YouTube, iTunes. Apple Podcasts. Leave a comment. We want to hear from you. We always encourage comments where you disagree, agree, have another point we might have missed, or you just want to say LOL or an emoji. We don't care. We love it all. And stay tuned for our next episode.